Well, hey, it's Matt. I'm back with another 10 by 7 inch transparent watercolor. This one is of a tan jumping spider on a yellow flower. If you're not a big fan of spiders, think of this as a floral painting, because most of it's flower and only a small amount's spider. After transferring the sketch onto the watercolor paper and masking off the spider, I mixed up some cadmium yellow light and put that down as my background with a fast wash. And then went about putting in some slightly more orange colors to start darkening up and building some depth with glazes on that background. And almost the initial wash was done with a 1-inch flat, but I switched to a 6-inch round for most of the rest of blocking in the big colors that you're seeing here. I'll use a well for mixing the larger washes, and then I'll switch to the butcher's tray that you'll see on the right for doing the other washes. And I'll pull from the well that I had just to get some of those yellows and mix in some oranges and reds to start putting in some of the depth to the flower. When I do these, I tend not to just use grays and blacks to knock back my yellows because it ends up looking dirty and kind of not that exciting. So I'll use a lot of oranges and reds to start building the depth and the shadows to the flower. And I find that extra saturated color and darkness works well while not just rendering it kind of a dull and lifeless kind of grayed out yellow. And you can see that there are many glazes to start getting that stripy look to the petals of the flower. And working so much on the background, you have to really think about the tones of your jumping spider that's going to be in the foreground later. So you're balancing all these yellows, but you have to be thinking about, okay, well, I'm going to have some grays and some brickish colors on the jumping spider and some lighter colors in there too. So you're kind of balancing what's going to be there, and that's a little bit of a danger in working with Frisket. You have to be able to imagine what's going to be there later and try to decide if your colors are on tone yet. So you can see from the palette that I'm starting to move in with more reds and oranges and not really using the yellows anymore. With time, I started bringing in some cadmium reds. Here you can see I'm using some chrome orange from an old tube. And right now I just dropped in some alizarin crimson to start bringing in some cooler reds for the shadow areas. And eventually I worked in some purples for the really deep dark areas. And you'll see from this that 90% of your time is spent on the background. And really, I think if that's one advantage of working kind of with the background first, is that you really make sure that all those details are interesting on their own. And then when you bring in the foreground, it'll really live in an environment that's very rich. If you start with the spider and work your way out, I think you're kind of starting with dessert, and you finish that and you're like, oh, all right, that's good enough, and you kind of leave the rest at a lower level of detail, which sometimes works and sometimes it leaves it lacking. For me, I always found it left my paintings lacking. Other people may have success with that. You can see I'm starting to bring in some of those purples and cadmiums and mix the darker colors for the super deep areas of it. At this point I was happy with the background, so I peeled off the Frisket and transferred the rest of my sketch over. And you can see I've got a bunch of photos of these tan jumping spiders that I've used to paint this. The eyes aren't actually red. This is kind of the reflected color that you're seeing in them, and I started with that base red color to kind of make it feel in its environment more, and then as I went in darkening that up, it all ends up reading correctly, at least to my eye, even though it had that bright red to begin with, and it kind of anchors it into its place. I kind of love these little jumping spiders with the big goggle eyes on them. They're kind of fascinating with the, they've got 8 eyes. Usually you only see 4 to 6 of them at a time. But they just kind of have an alien, I think they're kind of cute look to them. Maybe I'm crazy. And they also have all these tiny little hairs that come off the legs and the head with these tiny little spikes. And those are a challenge to render, and they're also fun to get right. The danger is making them too thick. You want them to look nice and filamentous without having big bristly things. Typically on the front legs they have some bigger bristles, which I think they use for help catching prey. So those have some larger spikes on them, but the head has these like tiny little tufts of hair. They're really kind of amazing. And another thing that's difficult with these is that they're very furry in some places, but then they have other parts, like you can see on the right leg, where it's very bare and you can see the shine coming off of them. So to render those areas and have a good transition between the shiny to the fuzzy parts is sometimes a bit of a challenge. And here I've switched over to some tiny brushes like 5 and 10 aughts. A lot of this work I'm doing under a magnifier. I don't know whether that tells you how small it is or how bad my eyes are, but at any rate, that's how it's done, and that's why the camera view is a little off to the side, because I needed the good view on this one. You can see I used a little tissue paper on this. I usually don't blot off color and scrub away at things, but on this one, that front left leg kind of got a little bit away from me, and I needed to pull some of those lighter values out to have it read the right thickness. And I went back into the background to round some things off and make sure everything was shaded well, and just some things didn't bother me when I did them initially, but as I started putting the spider in, I realized I did need those a little darker to have it read right. Because I want the spider to kind of drop back around that edge of the leaf, and it wasn't really happening at first. And some of those things you only see once you get the foreground in. That's one of the dangers of the frisket, is you can't always get every last thing done while it's on, and some of that you have to go back in carefully and paint it back in once it's removed. Here I switched to a croquill nib. This is really good for putting in those little spiky things because it's very, very sharp, and I can control that with a little bit more precision and fine line than I could a brush. The problem is you have to load that up with paint with a brush. So it's slower to get the paint on, but you do have better control with where it's going to actually land in the end. So here I was putting in a little bit of more color to the spider and getting the edges all wrapped away. And in the end, I really was just going around with some real darks, just trying to get every last detail in to sharpen up edges. You can see I was using a piece of tracing paper just so my hand didn't transfer any of the pigment on the painting and smudge it. That can be a good way to go if you don't have a painting glove handy. And here I was just dropping in a couple of shadows underneath the spider before calling it finished. So there it is. That's a tan jumping spider. and that's only 10 by 7 inches in transparent watercolor. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have a chance, have a peek at the blog or leave a comment.